Hace 16 años iniciamos este viaje, lo inauguró Frederick Lee y ha sido altamente productivo. En esta oportunidad tenemos como conferenciante principal al doctor Steve King. Ahora es un profesor, muchos años estuvo trabajando en Australia, en la Universidad de Australia, y ahora es profesor honorario del Colegio de la Universidad de London, y nos va a presentar un documento bastante interesante que es separando la ficción de la realidad en la teoría y en particular sobre la curva de la oferta. Realmente es un tema muy interesante. El profesor tiene un currículum verdaderamente impresionante. No voy a platicar mucho de ustedes lo pueden googlear. Sí, quiero nada más resaltar 2, 3 cosas. Uno, gracias a sus modelos y a la teoría, fue uno de los primeros, si no el primero en visualizar que se venía la crisis del 2008 y 2009. ¿Sí? Sus planteamientos, tanto en Australia como en Estados Unidos, le permitieron visualizar que venía esta gran crisis. Luego, bueno, pues ha desarrollado importantes trabajos, incontables documentos, artículos, libros. Este libro yo se los recomiendo mucho, de Banking Economics, sí, lo tradujo la Facultad de Economía hace 5 años aproximadamente, muy bueno. Y simplemente para sugerirles, sí, este libro es el que viene, ¿sí? The New Economics, no, a manifiesto. Es un excelente trabajo, ¿sí? Y vale mucho que ustedes lo adquieran rápidamente. Sí, tiene las siguientes partes: la razón de ser del documento, ¿sí? El dinero importa, la complejidad de nuestro mundo, economía, energía y medio ambiente, la enfermedad neoclásica, y las conclusiones, donde pues nos echa la bolita, que podemos ser el cambio. ¿Ok? Bien, sin más, welcome, dear Professor King. This is your home. Please, you have the word. Go ahead, please.
Your mic is not working.
Well, thank you, Gustavo, and you, Jorge, and all my friends there, Noemi. It's good to see a few familiar faces there, and I wish I could be with you, but what the best I can do is be electronic with you in the modern times. And thank you for the introduction about the book too, Gustavo. So what I'm going to be doing is talking more generally than just about the theory of the supply. I must be honest, I've just finished giving a talk in Poland. I got asked to write an emergency article for a newspaper in the UK to be published tomorrow. I didn't get a chance to update my presentation as well as I would have liked to. So I'm going into more detail on other subjects, but it's not as much as I would have liked on the supply curve. So maybe we can do that in the discussion later. But I want to start with it's a very seductive vision, the idea of prices being set by supply and demand. The whole vision of neoclassical economics is extremely seductive. You get this basic idea that there's an equilibrium point where supply equates with demand. You set price and you set quantity at the same time. And of course, you get all the welfare conclusions coming out as well. What I'm using here is Samuelson and Nordhaus, probably my least favorite economists on the planet. But this is a classic textbook and a classic presentation of the basic idea. And back when I was a young man, we went straight into deriving supply and demand curves from first principles. That doesn't tend to happen these days. But the basic idea of an upward sloping supply curve is supposed to come from the idea of diminishing marginal productivity. That idea, I think, isn't hammered well enough in the textbooks, but it's an essential part of the logic. Equally, a downward sloping demand curve is supposed to come from diminishing marginal utility. And so the intersection of the two will maximize social welfare, because at that point, the gap between total welfare and total cost is maximized. And that's the very seductive idea that I think grips the minds of students right from the very outset. And I think it's what defines why neoclassical economics has been so successful on hanging on to students' minds. But let's take a look at the individual theory of production first of all. So you have the idea of the market supply curve being the sum of the individual firm marginal cost curves. And this, I don't emphasize this in the presentation, but this is only true in perfect competition. Only true if you can draw a horizontal line for demand for the firm, and therefore that's also marginal revenue, and therefore that curve intersects with marginal cost on the marginal cost curve itself, and therefore you can derive a supply curve, which is why the concept of perfect competition is so crucial to mainstream economics. And the idea is that marginal cost rises with output because firms experience diminishing marginal productivity. And that is the only explanation in the textbook, in the conventional theory, of why supply gets more expensive with increasing volume. And Nordhaus argued this is an argument you can find in any textbook. Under the law of diminishing returns, a firm will get less and less output when it adds additional units of an input while holding other inputs fixed. So this is their classic illustration here. You can see over here they have a steady increase in the outputs of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You're using the same amount of land, 10 acres each time. You have steeply rising labour inputs. Initially, just go back one level there, you have 0 workers, then 6. 6 workers needed to produce the first tonne, 5 more to produce the second tonne, 4 more to produce the third, but then 6, 10, and 14 more to produce further units of output. You're paying the same land price, you're paying the same price per worker. So here's your total cost per unit. And then you get rising cost per tonne of output coming out of those assumptions. And when you graph it, what you get is initially a rising level of productivity per worker, but then a falling level of productivity per worker. And this section of the marginal product curve, it what gives you the rising section of marginal cost. And notice, by the way, in this drawing, marginal cost cuts through the average cost curve at 2.5 units when the output goes up to 10 units. So the point of intersection with marginal cost is well to the left of the graph, certainly nowhere near out in the far right-hand corner. And you see them, it's almost always intersecting between 20% and 50% out on the diagram of the quantity produced by the firm. And then marginal cost above average cost is the firm's supply curve. So here's the idea of having a horizontal demand curve. That's the idea of perfect competition. The firm will produce nothing at this level because it's losing money. There's its break-even point, and this point of pass, this is where it's getting its profit. So all the points of intersection of the marginal cost curve with the marginal revenue curve, which is taken as being a horizontal straight line, lie on the marginal cost curve. And that therefore gives you the supply curve of the firm. Nothing at all up until here. Then it jumps out to producing this quantity, and then it'll produce a higher quantity, but at a higher price. Here's your point of intersection of marginal cost with the minimum of average cost. Again, that's about 50-60% out on the diagram, nowhere near out to the right end of the axis. And when you add up all the Kern's marginal cost curves, add them horizontally, you get the market supply curve. So that's the basic logic behind driving a market supply curve. Now, all the examples that are used in textbooks, and I'll come back to this, are all made-up examples. You don't get data there for Tesla or General Motors or even Amazon. What you get is a made-up set of firms. But in the 1990s, Alan Blinder, who at the time was a vice chair of the Federal Reserve and a vice president at the American Economic Association, decided, well, let's go and ask real firms. And the reason he did that was because he was a member of the so-called New Keynesian School of Economics. To critics like myself, New Keynesians are neither new nor Keynesians. But nonetheless, that's how they label themselves. And sticky prices are an essential part of their argument as to why price mechanism alone doesn't eliminate unemployment or involuntary unemployment. So he decided to ask corporations, why do they set prices the way they do? And being somebody as prominent he was as an academic, he got tremendous funding, and he was able to ultimately survey firms that produce $319 billion worth of America's GDP, or 7.6% of the output of the non-farm for-profit sector in the manufacturing. It's a huge survey, in other words. And one of the many questions that were asked in the survey, and they were asked normally by PhD students face-to-face interviewing members of the corporation. So it wasn't a distant survey done by somebody irrelevant to the firm, normally a leading member of the firm answering these questions. They asked what would the shape of the marginal cost curve. And the conclusion that came out of this work, blind to summarise, in a truly awful drawing. He's an artist. Here's the drawing. I'll just actually move this display thing down the bottom here so you can see it more clearly if it's obscuring your screen like it obscures mine. But there he has his 32.6% of firms said they had falling marginal costs. Another 8% said falling with spikes at different points. 40.5% said their marginal cost was constant. Another 8% said constant with spikes. Only 11% said they had rising marginal cost. And Linder's response here was to say the overwhelmingly bad news here for economic theory is that only 11% of GDP is produced under conditions of rising marginal cost, which of course is assumed to be the rule in neoclassical textbooks. It said almost half is produced under constant cost. It leaves a stunning 40% of GDP in firms that report declining marginal cost functions. And they also reported having very high fixed costs, roughly 40% of total costs on average. And many firms saying they have falling rather than rising marginal cost. And he said, whether or not they know what they're talking about, we're talking about people who run the corporations here, their answers paint a picture of the average of the cost structure of their typical firm that is very different from the one immortalized in textbooks. And that's putting it mildly. Now, why does this happen? Let's just explain the empirical data. Well, in theory, in the economic theory, firms use all of their fixed inputs with a variable number of workers. The example that Samuelson and Nordhaus used was land, but the idea is you have one worker, 10 acres of land, so that one worker works the whole 10 acres. Same thing for the machines. So here is the statement from Samuelson and Nordhaus. Assume we are holding land, machinery, or other inputs constant. Well, that's also assuming that you use all your machines or all your land at once. So you have 100% capacity utilization with a trivial labour input. Now, there's some ideal ratio of workers to machines. Let's say, again, in the numerical example that Samuelson and Nordhaus used, let's say it's one worker per 3 acres. That's your ideal ratio. So productivity rises until you reach the ideal ratio, but then as you start putting more workers than are ideal relative to the number of machines you have, that's when diminishing marginal productivity starts to occur. Now, when you look in the real world, firms deliberately have excess capacity. They plan to have more capacity than they need right from the outset. And the reasons for that are quite simple. First of all, you operate your machines at an ideal ratio of workers to machines. You do not have too many or too few workers per machine. You have the ideal number of workers per machine. If you don't have enough workers for all your machines, you leave those machines idle. In the case of land, if you have 10 acres and you only have the ideal number of workers for 3 acres, you work 3 acres, you leave the other 7 fallow until you have more demand and therefore have more workers. You use the new machines or the new lines or the unused land only when your employment rises because of an increase in demand, and the productivity of the whole factory will rise as the utilization level approaches 100% because the firm is designed by engineers, not by economists, thank God, and the engineers make sure that it's most efficient when it's being used at full capacity. Now, why do they have the excess capacity? Well, the simple reason is that capitalism has been characterized by growth throughout its history. Growth of 2 to 3% in real terms per annum has been the long-term rule for capitalism, with booms and busts, obviously, but growth has been the norm. So when you build a factory, you don't build it so it's just large enough for today's demand, because if you did, you'd have to build another factory tomorrow. You build it big enough for, say, 5 or 10 or 15 years worth of demand. And then also, because you're in a competitive industry, you are trying to get more of that market for yourself than your competitors. You're all trying to get more than your competitors. So competition drives firms collectively to target more output than the industry can actually absorb. So given the fact you've got excess capacity overall, firms compete by trying to get as much of the market share as they possibly can. And the best way to do that is not by price competition, though of course you can use that, but by quality and features. So Tesla isn't winning the battle with the other automobile manufacturers because Teslas are cheaper. Teslas are winning because it does something no other car has done. Have to let some people into from the waiting room here. So if somebody else can do that, anybody that our co-host can keep an eye on the waiting room, I'd appreciate that. So it's just the down. Okay. So a successful firm secures a higher capacity utilization for itself than the unsuccessful firms, and that means it gets lower costs because it's at lower average fixed costs. It's amortizing a larger volume over amortizing the same amount of capital over a larger volume, and because the firm's getting more efficient with scale, it's got lower variable costs as well. So it comes out ahead, whereas the unsuccessful firms get lower capacity and higher cost. They lose out doubly. And there's numerous studies before Blinder came along that found the same result. Hall and Hitch back in the pre-war period, Lester just after the Second World War, Eitman and Guthrie and so on, and Fred Lee, of course. And you think of Fred Lee as was a friend, that dear departed Fred Lee to many people here. So that's the definitive survey done by Fred. Every last survey found the opposite of what is taught in textbooks. So why don't textbooks teach this real-world result? Why do they teach a false fantasy instead? And the reason is because, as Blinder himself put it, the actual data is very bad news for neoclassical theory. The reason being that if marginal cost is falling, it's therefore below variable cost as well as being below total cost. Total average cost. And if firms actually set price equal to marginal cost, they'd go bankrupt. So there's no way that the theory works. You cannot say that price is equal to marginal cost given real-world data, but yet price equal to marginal cost is vital for microeconomic theory, neoclassical theory, and it's integral now to the macroeconomics is based on micro. Throughout the derivation of a DSGE or a real business cycle model, the person will say, since price equals marginal cost, boom, okay, except for the industries where they assume non-perfect competition, they use price equal to marginal cost as a cancellation term throughout the whole system, the whole model. But the real world, given the fact that marginal cost falls for the vast majority of firms, and only a badly run firm will have rising marginal cost, given that marginal cost is constant or falling, and total cost per unit is falling over time, the real world must be a world of cost plus pricing. And here's a little, this again is moderately hypothetical data, looking at the silicon wafer factory, which has extremely high fixed costs, but low and declining marginal costs. So if you imagine a gigantic production of wafers, I'm showing here, and by the way, I want to come back to this, I'm showing large numbers here, 800,000 wafers per year, okay? Measurements in hundreds of thousands of units, which is valid for automobiles, for microchips, et cetera, okay, giant volumes, declining marginal cost, average variable cost being above marginal cost, fixed costs being substantial, far higher than variable costs, and your average cost being up here, and your price has to be a markup. So you cannot use marginal cost as a basis for setting price. You'd go bankrupt if you did very, very quickly. So this has something like this with the markup pricing, where you have a target output level as well, a target markup, and you try to get as far as you can out this side, selling more than your target, because that way you use more of your capacity, have lower costs to make a larger profit. Just think about it. If neoclassical theory was correct, that rising marginal costs would cause you to lose profit after a while, the negative, you'd be making losses on sales past a certain volume, then the role of a marketing director would be to say, stop production, don't sell any more units, because now marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue. What sales manager in history has ever told the firm to stop producing and stop selling? Any sales director who sold that would be sacked. So the whole idea that rising costs cuts off profitability for the firm is just nonsense. So that's your markup. You're above that level. So if we were truly an empirical theory, if economics was truly based on empirical data, the theory would have been thrown out decades ago, 80 years ago. The reality is that neoclassical teachers, first of all, don't know the empirical data. Most of them don't read this information. And secondly, they prefer their theory to reality. And the intriguing thing here is to make a comparison of what people actually read. So I mentioned Alan Blinder, deputy president of the American Economic Association. One person has ranked his book on Amazon, whereas Microeconomic Theory, written by Maskell, which is the neoclassical textbook for PhD programs, has 74 ratings. So only one person bothers to read this one, 74, and give a rating, 74 do over here, okay? Well, I wonder who wrote the only review of Alan Blinder's book on Amazon. Oh, that'd be me. Neoclassicals don't read anything which contradicts their beliefs. It is a religion. It is not a science. And this is a classic instance of that. But it gets better than that, because not only I'm not the only person who's bought a copy of Alan Blinder's asking about prices. I am the only person who's reviewed it on Amazon still, 20 years after it was published. But guess who else does not refer to Alan Blinder's empirical research in a textbook? Have a guess. Any guesses? Alan Blinder. Alan Blinder's textbook does not refer to his own research, okay? He has a textbook, he's rewriting Baumol's textbook, and the 2015 edition reproduces the same garbage, and pardon me, that's all it deserves to be called, the same garbage on diminishing marginal productivity and rising marginal cost. Here's his example of, I think it's a garage company, Al's Garage Company. There's your falling and then rising variable marginal cost. He doesn't even cite his own book. It's not in his references for this textbook. And he even claims that the law of diminishing returns was not a theoretical proposition, but an empirical one. He says this so-called law rests simply on observed facts. Economists did not deduce the relationship analytically. Pardon me for using an Australian expression here, but that's bullshit. It's always been based on analytic. It's the exact opposite of the truth. It has been contradicted by observation, not confirmed by it. So why do they do it? It's because they want to maintain the fairy tale. And the neoclassical theory is like a Fabergé egg, where if you pull one little element out, the whole thing collapses. And therefore, anything which challenges any of the core beliefs is ignored or rejected. And that's what's happened with this particular part of the theory. But even if you call them fairy tales, there's still, I don't know how many of you are old enough to have seen their wonderful American cartoon series, Fractured Fairy Tales, back with Rocky and Bullwinkle, back when some of us were young men and young women rather than the old men. Somebody muted me by accident. Hang on. Have I been unmuted? I can't see. Am I unmuted?
You're okay. You're okay.
Good. Okay, good. Okay. So here's a textbook example from Minsky, and he has a number of workers, output of cookies, marginal product falling, as you can see, cost of the factory constant, cost of the workers constant, total costs rising. And that's a little example. And notice the number of cookies, 0, 50, 90, up to 155. That gives you the following data. And this is not in Mankiw's book. I had to do this myself. Didn't take long. But this is then taking the same numbers for that example and drawing the marginal cost, average fixed cost, average variable cost, price, marginal revenue, profit, blah, blah, blah. Now, this is what it looks like when you graph it. Now, notice what's going on here. This is why I was making such a song and dance about where does marginal cost intersect average total cost. First of all, it's intersecting way out to the right-hand side of the axis. And average fixed cost, rather than average total cost rising steeply, they're rising only a tiny bit. It's really steep marginal cost over there. It looks awful. It's ugly. Okay. Why doesn't it look like this? Now, there's a typical drawing from Varian, and I emphasize the word drawing because there are no numbers on any of the axes. That is simply what somebody did with a stroke of a pen, putting a diagram on a page. So why, using numbers, do you get a shitty thing looking like this rather than this nice, neat, lovely looking diagram? The reason is you only get nice looking graphs with low numbers or no numbers on the quantity axis. And the reason is quite simple. Average variable cost, the way it's plotted by Neoclassical with rising marginal cost, ends up being a quadratic or a third order polynomial, something of that nature. So at least it's based on terms in Q squared. Okay, but average fixed cost is an inverse function. It's fixed cost divided by Q. Now, if you want to have the two looking like a standard drawing for the Neoclassicals, you can only use small values of Q. Otherwise, they look awful looking diagrams. So you get crazy compromises in the textbooks. And the one which it's hilarious. I almost feel like I'm doing a psychological profile of damaged people and saying, how did they reach these crazy notions? What's going on in their minds? So Mankiw has two totally different drawings for total cost. He has Hungry Helens and Thirsty Thelmas. He loves alliteration, does our Mankiw. Now, he used Thirsty Thelmas to derive the average variable and marginal cost curves. So here's Hungry Helens, and notice the numbers there, big numbers, 0, 10, out to 150 per hour, whereas Thirsty Thelmas, only 0 to 10, small numbers. Okay. Well, if you use Thirsty Thelmas with these small numbers, what you get numerically is a nice looking diagram that's got the typical shape. Notice where marginal cost intersects about halfway out. Average total cost is rising moderately quickly. It looks like the standard drawing. But if you try to do the same thing with Hungry Helens, you get a shitty looking diagram like I showed you a moment ago. So he doesn't use those numbers. And I think what I would suggest to students here, try it yourself. Go and check the textbook. See where they use numerical examples. See where they've got ones which involve large numbers and graph those, and then show that to your micro lecturer and ask, why does it look so bad? So it's nonsense. It is a non-theory. It should be thrown out. It is not something which anything calling itself a science should be using to describe the real world. And the same thing applies to the theory of consumption. So if you look at how consumer behavior is supposed to occur, the idea is you're supposed to have a utility maximizing consumer subject to a budget constraint. And what you draw, first of all, is a budget line showing how many units of food you could buy with your whole income to how many units of clothing you could buy with your whole income. And then you vary the price of the food. So here's the illustration from Samuelson and Nordhaus again. And this number here, pardon me, why did I go blank? Okay, went too quickly. Okay, that's the idea of the budget line. So there's your budget line. And that's given by a fixed income and a fixed price for clothing, a fixed income and a fixed price for food. Then what you do is you have indifference curves that show combinations of food and clothing and give you the same utility. And that's the curve approach there. And you put the two together and you get utility maximizing behavior. So given a given income and a given price for clothing and a given price for food, there's the point that maximizes that consumer's utility. And then you vary the price while holding the income constant. So the point N doesn't change. Here's one line, here's a second. And what he's graphing here, of course, is not a standard way of showing a demand curve. It's showing a price-demand combo through time. But if you then derive, that's what gives you a downward sloping market individual demand curve. Now, Samuelson was criticized. Samuelson invented the idea of indifference curves, and he was criticized for it by saying, well, you can't actually see them. They're unknowable. He said, well, actually, you can work them out using what he called the axioms of revealed preference. And the idea here was that you could infer them from the actual behavior of consumers. So you present a consumer with three shopping trolleys, red, green, and blue, and a rational consumer is assumed to be able to decide which shopping trolley she prefers. That's called completeness. Transitivity says that if you prefer red to green and green to blue, then you prefer red to blue. That's the definition of rational behavior. Non-association says more is preferred to less. So if you have two identical trolleys and you put one more item into one of those trolleys, you prefer the one with the extra item. On convexity, and this is just saying a linear combination of any two trolleys is preferred to the two trolleys themselves because it's giving you a wider range of choice. So that's the basic idea. And in 1997, a German economist called Sippel, I think, decided to make the theory look real to his students by saying, I'm going to show you what your indifference curves look like. I'm going to ask you some questions and I'm going to reveal your preferences to you. So what he did, he set up a very careful experiment where he had ultimately 42 students in total, given a choice of 8 different commodities and with multiple different budget lines and different testing elements, each testing a different part of the axioms. And his conclusion was that he found, rather than showing the students what their preferences were, rather than revealing to the students their indifference curves, he found so many contradictions of the theory that he said you can't use it as a description of how people actually behave. It does not describe how people behave in a normal case. He said, so recognizing these limits, we should be perhaps a little more modest in our imperialist ambitions of explaining non-market behavior by economic principles. In other words, this was a failure that, again, should have caused the theory to change itself. Now, these were the goods that students were confronted with. And the thing was, after they made their choices, they randomly allocated one of the 10 different sets of bundles that they chose. And he said the students were very careful, worked very carefully, work out what they preferred, and were looking forward to get their favourite of the 10 combinations that they were confronted by different budget choices and so on. So they actually got to consume what was being tested here. There were none of the problems about time series and so on that damaged other attempts to test revealed preference. Now, why did they fail? Why did students not behave rationally? Well, the simple answer is there were too many shopping trolleys. If you imagine that students were given just 7 discrete choices, so between 0 and 6 units of each of those things that they could choose, how many different shopping trolleys would there be? If there's only one commodity, you have 7 trolleys between 0 and one trolley has nothing in it, one trolley has 1 unit, trolley 2 has 2, trolley 3 has 3, and so on. When you have 2, you've got 128 trolleys. Okay. With 3, there's 2,000 trolleys. With 8 commodities, you have the number of goods raised to the power of the choices plus 1 as it happens. And that gives you 2 million shopping trolleys. So the different ways students could have combined these 8 commodities in this experiment, if they could only choose between 0 and 6 units of each, would be 2 million shopping trolleys. So what you've got, which looks really easy when you see it in a simple simple two-dimensional drawing, considering just 2 commodities on a piece of paper, on a textbook. It's nonsense when you try to do it to scale. You're overwhelmed by choice. And so to cope with that, rather than maximizing, you satisfy. The real failing here, and actually von Neumann noticed this when he was critiquing this in the theory of games, is completeness. Completeness is impossible. It's the curse of dimensionality. It means there are so many choices that you can't make your mind up. And you won't choose the one that optimizes. If you do, you'd starve to death. So it only works on a 2-dimensional diagram. The number of commodities raised to the power of the number of combinations you're looking at. When you look at a supermarket, it's at least 20-dimensional. If you thought of what different types of products you can buy in a supermarket, cereal, meat, vegetables, etc., that sort of classification, you're going to at least have a 20-dimensional problem. You've got 1 billion shopping trolleys to consider. So you can't and you don't utility maximize. But that's not the end of it. Even if that's what you did do, you still wouldn't get a downward sloping market demand curve. So this is the crazy thing. The theory doesn't work on so many levels, it's embarrassing. So, but Samuelson and Nordhaus, and this is, I've come to expect this from Samuelson, actually more from Nordhaus than Samuelson, here is their explanation, saying the market demand curve is found by adding together the quantities demanded by all individuals at each price. And then this is the illustration they've got, the Smith's demand and Brown's demands, and you add the two together. And he then poses, does the market demand curve obey the law of downward sloping demand? It certainly does. What a triumphant, convincing statement to a naive student who doesn't go and read the research papers on which this is based. And I did, of course, go and read these research papers, one written by Samuelson in 1956. Now, when you look at it, what's going on is here, when you derive individual demand curves, you're changing the relative price, but you're not changing income. This is a fixed point when you're working with a single individual. When you start looking at an entire economy, then you have to include the income source of everyone in that economy. And if you change the price of food, if you make food cheaper, you make food producers poorer. And they're part of the demand curve for food. So you can't keep a fixed point anymore. That point will move. And therefore, you get income effects coming out of this as well as substitution effects. So the point N will move every time you try to sum individual demand curves. And that therefore sets a condition for you to work out an impossibility condition. Under what conditions can you do this and still get a downward sloping market demand curve? Now, Samuelson set these conditions out. This is the guy who said it certainly does, that you can do it. He set the conditions out in 1956. He said, allocating the same totals differently amongst people must generally change the resulting equilibrium price ratio. The only exception, it was tastes are identical. So we all are the same. Me and Gustavo both eat the same things. Gustavo actually likes to eat raw chili peppers, so I must like to eat raw chili peppers. My wife made that mistake today early, by the way, and choked for a short while. The only exception where tastes are identical, and wait for this, not only for all men, but for all men, that should be men, not me, when they are rich or poor. So in other words, if you, first of all, your taste must be the same as everybody else's. And secondly, your taste must not change as your income rises. So, for example, you consume 7 pizzas and 1 toilet roll a week when you earn $100 a week. And when you get to the stage of earning $10,000 a week, you eat 700 pizzas and 100 toilet rolls. Okay, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. But this is not seen as crazy by neoclassical economists, again, because they don't want to confront the failings of their own theory. So here's the first person to discover this, who wrote, in the year I was born, 1953, the necessary and sufficient condition quoted above is intuitively reasonable. What is the condition? An extra unit of purchasing power should be spent in the same way, no matter to whom it is given. Now, that is not intuitively reasonable. That is intuitively nonsense. Okay. That means that if I give $1 to Elon Musk, he'll spend 50 cents on it getting to Mars. And if he gives me $1, I'll spend 50 cents on getting to Mars. No, I won't. I might like to, but I won't. So Samuelson's solution, Samuelson thought he got a way around this problem. He said, first of all, you can aggregate for the individual to the family on the basis that since blood is thicker than water, preferences of the different members are interrelated by what we call the consensual or social welfare function, taking into account the ethical worths of the consumption levels of each of its members, blah, blah, blah. What that says, the family acts as if it's maximizing a single welfare function. So that means that all Americans are in one big happy family. Okay? No such thing as families who hate each other. Okay? Well, that's pretty damn ridiculous, but I'll let him get away with that temporarily. So he's gone from individuals to families. How does he get from families to the entire nation? The same argument will apply to all of society if optimal reallocations of income can be assumed to keep the ethical worth of each person's marginal dollar equal. In other words, he's assuming that there's a benevolent central authority sitting over America, of all bloody places, that for any given set of prices and wealth function redistributes wealth in order to maximize social welfare before consumption starts. So I think you might call this benevolent central authority Donald Trump, for example. I mean, this is ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous. But this is what they've done. So it's nonsense. Micro is a disease. It should be driven out of economics in general. But of course, a lot of macroeconomists say, well, if we don't have micro, how can we derive macro? Well, the answer is you can derive it anyway, and I'll show you in a moment. But this particular proof, the Sonnenschein-Mantel theorem, as is known, should have brought neoclassical micro to an end. If you have a whole bunch of individuals who each do utility maximize and do therefore obey the law of demand, the resulting market demand curve can have any continuous real function shape at all. And this is Sonnenschein and Schaefer stating it properly. Market demand functions need not satisfy in any way the classical restrictions, meaning you can't get a downward sloping demand curve out of market demand curves. The utility hypothesis tells us nothing about market demand. So what's the problem? Well, fundamentally, neoclassical theory does not include the distribution of income. The reason demand falls as price rises is poor people can't afford to buy the stuff anymore. That's fundamentally the reason. When you change prices, you change the distribution of income. So a change in income distribution changes demand. And without a theory of income distribution, which is what the classical theory had, which was based on the level of social classes and relative power levels, you can't explain why demand falls as price rises. So the neoclassical theory is bereft of logic. And a huge part of this, I think, comes out of what's happened to the concept of equilibrium and modelling over time. If you go back and you read Jevons and Marshall and Walras and Menger and so on, you find that all of them regard equilibrium as a crutch. It was something they used in the 19th century because they didn't know how to do dynamics back then. They didn't have Apple computers, et cetera, et cetera. And they thought that what would happen in the 20th century is the development of a dynamic modelling. This is Clark who gave us the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. And he thought we're going to get a dynamic modelling in the 20th century. Now, neoclassicals might argue they did that with DSGE models, but in my opinion, they're neither dynamic nor general. They're static, stochastic equilibrium models. They've got nothing to do with dynamics. And the great mathematician John Blatt wrote a wonderful book, which is now available, by the way. I haven't mentioned this before, Gustavo, but Blatt's Dynamic Economic Systems has now been reprinted, and I'd highly recommend any students who want to learn economics properly to get a copy of that. But he was so dismissive of what economists called dynamics that he said capitalism as a social system may well disappear before its dynamics are understood by economists. I think that may have actually turned out to be true rather than just a joke. Now, of course, Blatt was writing in 83 and he's a mathematician. Maybe he doesn't know what he's talking about, but this is Paul Romer, who won the Nobel Prize in 2018, saying that from the 1980s, macro's gone backwards. They've got such a non-committal attitude to the truth that he prefers to call it not postmodern, but post-real. So economics is in a dreadful state, and we need to get rid of what currently exists. So micro foundations have to go. And part of the reason that micro foundations don't work is what's called complexity theory. And physicists are well aware of this. So this is quoting a real Nobel Prize winner, Anderson, and Philip Anderson. And he said it's quite possible to rank sciences and say that science X depends upon the particle, but depends upon science Y. So solid state physics depend upon particle physics, and chemistry depends upon body physics, and molecular biology depends upon chemistry, and cell biology depends upon molecular biology, blah, 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 until you get to the social sciences where psychology is the foundation of everything. What he said is the fact that you can structure it this way doesn't mean you can work from here to get to psychology. So reductionism, which has been a very effective tactic for scientists, does not imply constructionism. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not mean you can start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. Instead, every new level has its own ways of thinking, which is at least as interesting as the ones below. So psychology is not applied biology, and nor is biology applied chemistry, and equally, neither is macro applied micro. So we've got to get rid of it. So it's a futile foundation. First of all, the foundations themselves are fictions. They're either false or impossible. And in general, in complex systems, you can't derive one complex system level from another one. So the fear that neoclassicals have is, oh my God, we're going to be adrift at sea, without a rudder. How do we steer the ship if we don't have micro foundations? Well, the answer is, and this is actually Olivia Blanchard. I've had a few exchanges with Olivia over the years on Twitter. Quite reasonable exchanges, actually quite polite, which is unusual when dealing with neoclassical economists. But in a paper called Do DSG Models Have a Future, he said, starting from explicit micro foundations is clearly essential. Where else to start from? Thinking in terms of a set of distortions to a competitive market means a long slog from the competitive model to a reasonably plausible description. But again, where else can you start from? Well, you can actually start from macro. You can derive macroeconomics from macro itself. And I want to finish on this particular note. Let's take three definitions. The employment rate, which I'm going to call lambda, which is the number of workers the number of people with a job divided by the number of people. The wages share of GDP, which is the wages bill divided by GDP. And the private debt ratio, which is the level of private debt divided by GDP. Those are definitions. And the output to employment ratio, normally called labour productivity, but I dispute that. I'll come back to that in discussion if necessary. And the capital to output ratio. Now, if you differentiate the first three with respect to time, you turn those definitions into dynamic definitions. This is still a definition. The employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of change in the output to labour ratio and population growth. The wages share will rise if total wages grow faster than GDP, and the debt ratio will rise if debt grows faster than GDP. Those are still actual, they're not theoretical propositions, they're facts, definitional facts. Now, we have some reasonable simplifying assumptions. So I assume as a uniform wage rate, a constant capital output ratio, rising output to labour ratio, and a rising population, and a linear wage setting Phillips curve fundamentally, and investment based on the rate of profit, also a linear function. And what I get out of that is Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. I've got to let somebody else into the waiting room here. Okay. So that's, again, if I was, I can show this if I have more time, but this is a very simple set of equations. This is the employment rate rising if the growth rate exceeds growth in the output to labour ratio plus population growth. This is the wage level rising if wage demands exceed growth in the labour to output ratio. And this is the debt ratio rising if the investment minus profit share minus the debt times growth rate is positive. And those are the other ancillary definitions there. I put that together in my Minsky software, which I once gave a course of in Mexico, as you might remember, Gustavo. And it will let you simulate this model, and you get a model which gives you the same fundamental characteristics as we saw across the Great Moderation and the Great Recession. You had a period of diminishing cycles in growth and then rising cycles. You had a rising level of private debt, and you had the workers' share of income falling as the debt level rose. There's a lot more to explain what's going on there, but this is the start of building a structurally based model of the economy with simplifying assumptions, genuine simplifying assumptions, not fantasies like neoclassicals use, which reproduce the basic characteristics that we've seen in capitalism for the last 50 to 70 years. So one more person to come in here. Okay. So that's where I'll stop my presentation, but we have to get rid of microeconomics. And there's a decent micro to be done, but it's got nothing to do with neoclassical economic theory. It's got a lot to do with power laws and quality competition and the real world. And that's what we should be analyzing, not this neoclassical fantasy.
Okay, Steve, thank you so much. And this is an excellent presentation in the crucial points to critics the neoclassical fantasy. Very good. Now, I want to let Noemi Levy. She is a notable professor at the Faculty of Economics. She has a different reaction about your presentation. Ahora, bueno, vamos a escuchar a nuestra querida compañera Noemi Levy, ¿sí? La doctora Noemi Levy, quien tiene algunos comentarios y algunas puntualizaciones a la presentación de Steve. Doctora, ¿quiere abrir su micrófono y compartirnos sus reflexiones?
Buenos días a todos. Gracias por la invitación. Good morning to everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to comment Steve King's presentation. It's important for students to know that it's something else in microeconomics than what is taught in the classrooms. I would like to thank all the people of Microeconomics, Jorge Bustamante, Jorge Ibarra, Rogelio, Gustavo, Seika, for inviting me. And also, it's very important to highlight that 120 students, I think most, are listening to us, which is very important for a more alternative view, a more alternative discussion of economics. I think I want to congratulate the organizers because this is very important for economics. Finally, and I ask permission for Jorge Bustamante to do that, I would like to pay tribute today to Tracy Mott, who passed away last month, who was a highly critical post-Keynesian with whom we could learn a lot. Well, I have a problem in commenting Steve King's lecture. I agree with almost everything, so I have to do some interesting. I want to put forward some discussion on what he was told, what he said. Sorry, I'll start saying that's a very interesting discussion and a very provocative conclusion. If average and marginal cost curve doesn't have a rising slope, specifically a U-shaped form, with one breaking point, there is no equilibrium position, which I mean minimizing cost or more maximizing returns. More importantly, Steve King continues, there is no neoclassic firm theory, so it doesn't hold. The rising marginal cost assumption, law of decreasing return, in microeconomics is very, very important. It's more or less like the say law at the macroeconomic level. It's a central assumption that supports the neoclassical theory. So it's a problem criticizing these assumptions. The first assertion is that average and marginal cost equality is not useful tool to determine production volume because it's rejected the U-shaped cost curve, specifically the rising section of the marginal curve. The rejection of the marginal curve upward slope means that the law of diminishing return doesn't hold. It's a big problem. And tell us that it's partly explained due to the findings that fixed costs are not so low as assumed by Neoclassical, which is completely true. Interesting blind position. I want the same one that was the Fed vice president, isn't it, Steve? If I'm not confusing him. I don't think he's okay. Blinder find it's not true, but he still accepts the theory and introduces sticky prices that some theoreticians relate with Keynesian position. Actually, as far as I remember from lecturing microeconomics, Steindl presents a model based on short-term constant marginal cost and variable cost, explained by plant excess capacity from what follows L long-term average cost with different price level. I remember that from my early days when of teaching that I was assigned microeconomics, and I used a popular book in that time, Modern Microeconomics, written by Asimopoulos, which was rather more pluralistic book. When I was forced to move to Varian, I decided to quit macroeconomics teaching, and I went to a macroeconomic level.
Good choice.
Yes. In this sense, another important conclusion behind the relation of the U-shaped marginal average is the assumption of demand in excess. This is a problem that goes throughout not only the micro, but I would argue that the macroeconomic level, and in some points, even James, when discussing, uses that assumption. But anyway, this is very important for the construction of the famous supply curve, which Steve explained very nicely. I'm not going into the utility and all these assumptions, which are quite unrealistic. It's a fairy tale. I agree completely with Steve in that sense. Then why diminishing marginal productivity doesn't apply to firms' cost structure? Well, it's what Steve says. It's impossible to operate with exact operating capacity in each period. It's you need a plant. The firm cannot operate efficient size. It needs excess capacity, and it needs an excess capacity which is actually planned. In this sense, I again go back to my textbook with the L form average and marginal cost, where you have all the Bain models, the Silos-Levy price limits, another, which is what's interesting to teach, I suppose, in microeconomics. Before ending this part, I want to raise a couple of questions. How fixed prices are measured, assuming that firms require excess plant capacity because they just cannot expand the first plant production in the short time, and technology also determines the plant size. So this is an important issue of how to do it, because we continue. If you go to the everyday's life, you will find that firms always operate with excess capacity, specifically if you operate under an oligopolistic structure. In this context, second, regarding sticky prices, I recall that Casey also put forward that idea when rejecting this, I think the law say. In this context, I want to remind today Tracy Mott, because he was the one that somehow was arguing that new Keynesians in this context can be put not in the post-Keynesian, but taken away from the neoclassical theory. We had discussions with Jorge Bustamante around that. It's difficult for me to put them in the post-Keynesian view, but certainly they are a bit different from the hardcore neoclassicals. In financial economics, which today I do most, they reject the perfect competitive solution. The second important issue, obviously, well, they're not listening about prices. Obviously, entrepreneurs don't know what marginal costs are. This is something that you don't need to go through the microeconomic levels to know. And maximizing solution is not considered in firms' behavior. The only condition an enterprise recognizes is that the unit cost fall as the scale of output rises, given the firm's capacity level. Actually, this was something that Kalecki also confronted when he was discussing the investment determinants. I think it was in Oxford, which when he was in Oxford, they did a general survey to show what if enterprises consider the rate of interest. And it appeared that nobody cared about the rate of interest unless it moves very, very highly. The move was very, very large. So Neoclassical's model they construct their discourse on a logical model. The problem is that the empirical error is that their models are empirically irrelevant. I think I really enjoyed all the quotes that Steve put in this paper about Freeman, which is completely true. And it's clear that neoclassical models develop into mathematical logic model, Wood for Kalisch, Soskais, and all these textbooks, which are very little economics explanation. Actually, in our postgraduate department, we have a problem because half of the exam is on microeconomics and all the mathematical proofs of microeconomics. So we get engineers, we get physicists, we got all kinds of people, not economists. And we have a problem in teaching economics and much more effort to put through our views. In this context, an interesting thing that puts Steve is highlighting the difference. I think this is very important, the difference between simplistic assumption and domain assumption. I think this is very important when we teach economic, not only micro, but any type of economic, which are the assumptions you are using. In this sense, I think the discussion put in the paper is very, very important. And the difference when he speaks about Galileo's vacuum assumption, if we wouldn't have a vacuum, the solution would be the same. But if we have that the rising marginal cost, if the neoclassical theory don't have it, obviously, it's the theory does not withhold. In this sense, we need to discuss with students when we start with an economic theory, which are the important assumptions that we are using. This, I think, a central assumption that we have to consider. The critical importance of unrealistic assumption, how prices are set. Neoclassical theory doesn't have a solution for this. I may add, Keynes doesn't have it either. There is no real competition in their models, perfect competition, and market structure nor profit margins are considered. I think this is a big problem. I would argue that Kalecki was the only heterodox author that put forward the idea that prices are determined by direct cost plus profit margin, in which the market structures plays an important part. I want to remind that Kalecki had two types of prices. One type explained by changes and the other by changes in the back factor. This is important when reading again Kalecki, which I'm using a lot now. In this context, we need to consider the discussion of oligopolistic structure, and there comes how big and small firms interact. Standard analysis extended by Lavini also need to consider the impact of technology And lastly, the impact of financial costs. And this is very interesting here. When Minsky put forward his hypothesis of financial stability, and he puts his microeconomic analysis in terms of how financial costs intervene, he has a problem. And he translates it to macroeconomics. And this was put very well, very nicely by the paper of Sekarecha and Lawa, that he forgot that there are some profits in the economy. So also we need to consider that part of the story. Perhaps another example of how unrealistic neoclassical model is the proposition put forward by Fama, the so-called efficient, which finds equilibrium or correct prices irrespective of whether they are oligopolistic big firms, and well, also the idea that crisis result of external shocks, and when we get all the information, we go back to some normal situation, which still I don't know which is the one. The big discussion, I think Steve put it forward, is what to teach in microeconomics. I would argue that one enormous important thing is teach how prices are determined and the role of investment finance. Sorry, this is my bias to economics. We need to go certainly to a more pluralistic view of economic theory. Facto, and more important, teach students what's the difference between core and simplistic assumption. I hope, I would argue that the logical model based on this core assumption need to be critically taught to highlight students the different institutional elements and where they would and when they were put forward. I would leave aside all this craziness of mathematical and try to show one and second and third solution, which Steve is completely right and completely unrealistic. Why to use so much time and the student that really want to study economics to go with all this mathematical meaningless discussion? I will finish by stating that we have to agree that in economics, the science is not neutral. It has interests. And in this context, we also need to highlight this to students. We don't have to be afraid that the ideology, in the good sense of the word, is used in because we are looking for certain solutions, we are looking for certain policy, and in this case was very clearly, I'm speaking to my fellow neoclassical economics, even in their language, to change economic policy and get out of this crisis. In this sense, I think we need to go back to study a more pluralistic economic theory, and we need to highlight what the questions that the theory are looking forward are trying to answer. Thank you very much, and it was a real pleasure, Steve, to comment your paper. Gracias a todos.
Okay.
Muchas gracias, Noemi. Thank you. Steve, do you want to react to the Noemi's ideas?
Yeah, I'll try to be to brief on this, but there's actually one question which is posed as well. Would it be possible to live in a world where machines replace the work of humans? I think actually that's where we're headed if we survive the ecological crisis, and that is a big if, given how bad it is. And neoclassical economists, you might be aware, I blame for a major part of the crisis we're in, especially William Nordhaus. But ultimately, what produces output is not so much human labour as human ingenuity expressed in machines that process energy and matter and make it converted to useful energy and useful materials as well. And if we're going to survive as a species, we have to take production off planet, which is one of the only thing I'm going to agree with Jeff Bezos on. That is a necessity for the future. And in that case, the vast majority of output will be effectively done by machines, which humans tend and repair when necessary, but fundamentally they've got to be self-servicing. So at some point, the capacity of the vast majority of the population to get an income because of labour is going to disappear, and we have to prepare for that future. If we don't prepare for it, we'll end up in the Hunger Games. In terms of some of the points Noemi made in her comments, first of all, on New Keynesians, I don't regard them as allies, I regard them as enemies. And the reason is simple. They take the place that we could place that they didn't exist, because pure neoclassicals are people like Sargent and Lucas, who argued that the Great Depression was a decision by workers to take a holiday because the pay rate wasn't high enough, so they decided to enjoy leisure instead. Absolute nonsense like that. If that's what was being published by economists, by neoclassical economists, then they'd be laughed out of existence, and we'd get a chance to come in and give a realistic alternative. Because New Keynesians take the basic neoclassical foundations and then make them bend them a bit so they appear to fit the data, it makes them look more realistic, and they therefore preserve the neoclassical foundation in a way that wouldn't happen if they didn't exist. My analogy, and I've often come back to talking in terms of Copernicus versus Ptolemy, is that if you had the strict Aristotelian vision of the universe, that the Earth is at the centre of a series of perfect spheres, then pretty rapidly that theory would have been thrown out, because it was obvious that the planets didn't move as something on a perfect sphere would do around the Earth. But when Ptolemy came along and said, well, there's actually spheres on spheres, and that explains why the planets seem to reverse direction occasionally, that kept that wrong idea about the universe going for 1,500 years. So in that sense, the New Keynesians are keeping alive a theory that should die. And I think they're actually more of our enemy in that sense than the extreme neoclassicals who you can simply laugh at. In terms of how we set things, how determine prices are set, output volumes and so on, I agree that Koleski's work on the principle of increasing risk is extremely important. That's what we should be using. I would highly recommend looking at the work of John Blatt, because he partly answers the question about why are interest rates not important, the point that you also mentioned, Noemi, about Koleski's research. Why do manufacturers not care much about the rate of interest unless there's a huge change? It's because in the neoclassical theory, the only thing which can change your level of investment for the future is the interest rate, because that changes how much you discount your perfectly correctly anticipated revenues from the future income streams from your investments. That's how they treat uncertainty. They make it into risk at best and say a high interest rate means some products no longer have a positive net present value. That's why investment falls. That's how they relate investment to the rate of interest. But in the real world, what determines is your expectations of the future, which are uncertain. And Blatt does a beautiful job of showing you can have a mathematical model of investment, which ends up supporting the idea of break-even calculations, sort of stuff that accountants do, rather than net present value. And he has a concept he calls a greedy but cautious criminal. I highly recommend reading that. And we could get a decent economics with plenty of mathematics in it where it helps, of micro, without this nonsense of neoclassical economics. And I'd be teaching Schumpeter's approach to entrepreneurism, Koleski's approach to finance as being the limit on how much in production you produce, and Blatt on how you make investment decisions, and talking about how power laws evolve out of this, which is what we see in the actual distribution of firms that has nothing to do with perfect competition or monopoly. You get a power law distribution of firm sizes. Explaining that would be a very interesting challenge in a worthwhile microeconomics, which would have nothing to do with neoclassical economics.
Thank you, Steve.
Sorry, we have two more questions. Maybe Professor King wants to answer it. The first one is, how important is the individualistic method for neoclassical theory? And the second one, why is the for neoclassical theory, it's important the decreasing returns.
Okay, let me ask another question that is very similar. Is how important do you consider that the method is for the theory results? And it's similar like you says, Jorge. Thank you.
Okay.
The theory is incredibly important to neoclassical economics because without price equal to marginal cost, you don't get a supply curve. Okay, so the whole idea, this is why they obsess about perfect competition, because only with perfect competition can you actually derive a supply curve in the first place. Okay. So if on top of that, this marginal cost doesn't determine the supply curve at all, so there is no supply curve, you don't have a demand curve and you don't have a supply curve. So there's a black hole in the middle of the theory if you admit any of the empirical critiques that I've covered in today's talk. So it's absolutely vital to the theory at that intellectual level. And then when it comes to developing things like real business cycle model or DSG models and so on, the DSG models in particular will break the economy into sections where perfect competition applies and sections where it's imperfect competition. And the imperfect competition, that's where the hard slog comes out and working out the logic. But when you're assuming price equals marginal cost, that is often used as a cancellation term to eliminate a large part of the mathematics and let you move on to the next stage of the optimization routine. Now, if that's false, you can't even get there. If there is no such thing as perfect competition, which I've shown mathematically anyway, is a fallacy. But even just looking at what I've talked about today with a falling marginal cost curve, then you could never apply it. So the whole theory has to be based on imperfect competition, and it's impossible to build a coherent theory that way. So it is incredibly important, the theory, which is why they ignore the fact that it doesn't work.
Okay.
Okay, we have another question. Can we know which industry is working with decreasing returns?
With decreasing returns?
Yeah.
Virtually none. Okay. If you look at the survey, what Blinder concluded was 89% of industry had increasing returns. And this is not increasing returns to scale, by the way, which is a different concept again. This is increasing returns to volume. So the higher the output level you produce, the lower your costs are. So the that increasing returns to volume is the normal case. Now, Blinder found 89%. That's partly because he had PhD students who believed in neoclassical theory, explaining it to the people answering the questions, really confusing them. When you look at the work done by people like Eitman and Guthrie and Means and so on, who did other sorts of surveys, the answers they got back had 95 to 98% of firms reporting increasing returns to volume. There's a particular paper by Eitman and Guthrie that I really enjoy, where they showed 8 different drawings to people from corporations and saying which of these 8 drawings suits your actual situation. And only one of those drawings is strictly the neoclassical drawing, where you have a classic U-shaped demand curve. And I think of about 400 people answering the survey, 2 or 3 chose that. So like 99% of them report increasing returns to volume. And the reason is that economists, thank God, do not design factories. Engineers do. If you look at the textbook, and Minsky is particularly bad on this front, he talks about workers bumping into each other and when they're trying to use the machine and obstructing each other and causing bottlenecks and so on and so forth. That's a badly designed factory. A well-designed factory has clean production lines. You're doing everything you can to minimize breakdowns, to make sure you've got your optimum ratio all the way through. Only an idiot would design a factory like neoclassical economists think all factories are. And in fact, some of the people who were surveyed were frankly insulted when they saw what neoclassical economists thought actually happened inside corporations. So by the vast majority of companies face increasing returns. The one difference to that, Naomi mentioned this when talking about Koleski as well, is Koleski had a two-price theory of capitalism. One was the standard stuff I've been talking about, where variable cost per unit variable cost falls over time as you increase production. That's the manufactured world. When you're talking about physical commodities produced, both agricultural and minerals, then you do have issues about having to use more inputs to your outputs. So if you want to get more oil out of a oil rig, you have to put more energy in, and you start getting diminishing returns in terms of energy in getting those out, because you're not working in a factory anymore, you're working with natural resources you're trying to exploit. Then you do start getting that increasing cost, and you do have demand-driven prices, setting prices, and supply cost rising with volume and so on. So you have to divide the economy. Manufacturing and most services have constant or falling marginal costs, and therefore marginal cost is irrelevant to price setting. But when you come to the minerals and so on, then it may well be the marginal cost that sets the price. But it's a critical part of the industry, but it's 3 to 5% of industry, not 95%, not the stuff they think they can explain with manufacturing, where the total opposite applies to what they argue.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I have another question. What implications would it have for the neoclassical theory to recognize that the firms operating with constant or increasing labor productivity and that average and marginal cost are declining?
The theory falls apart. And it is, as I said, it's like a Fabergé egg, where if you pull one element out, the whole thing collapses. So there's multitudinous areas where neoclassical theory can be shown to be wrong. I've covered it. They're wrong about supply. They're wrong about demand. That's a pretty good start. That knocks away the whole foundation fundamentally. What do? They ignore it. They make absurd assumptions to say they can aggregate individual demand curves and get a downward sloping market demand curve. They ignore the fact that supply marginal cost falls, so you can't have a marginal cost-based supply curve. So, and like even in finance, they ignore the financial crisis, okay, even after it happened. So you have an avoidance strategy. And this is really, again, that's why I think the best analogy for the state of neoclassical economics is astronomy before Copernicus. You have a theory which is fundamentally wrong. You assume the Earth is the center of the universe. You then build a model which can fit the observed data to explain where the planets will be. And there's incredible work for everybody trying to work out the mathematically intricate question of what's your center of rotation, how far from the Earth do you put the center of rotation for your whole system, how fast do you have the spheres rotating, how fast do the spheres on the spheres where the planets are rotate, in which direction, et cetera, et cetera. And it's incredibly complicated, thousands and thousands of different models to look at if you actually want to critique any of them. It's time consuming, it's challenging, it's intellectually rigorous, and it's totally wrong. Now, the only way is to throw it out and let's say the sun's the center of the solar system, and we then start having a realistic foundation. And so I think economics is like a pre-Copernican discipline right now. We've had our Copernican moments, they continue ignoring it. It's time to say the Earth is not the center of the economic universe.
Okay, and the last one, the professor Luis Luna asked you why in neoclassical theory it is built only for diminishing return.
It's already in the chat. It's already in the chat in English.
Okay, diminished return. In reality, indicates that the most of the cases, the firms are in constant or increasing returns.
Yeah, it's fundamentally because the idea of a subjective theory explaining the real world had to require the idea of on consumers diminishing marginal utility and on producers diminishing marginal cost. Without that, you can't get your supply and demand, scissors, in Marshall's term, actually operating. And so that's why it's so essential to have it. And if you think about what the neoclassical theory of production is, it's exactly the same as the neoclassical theory of consumption, just flipped around. So the idea you have about consumers is consumers maximize utility, and you maximize utility by consuming commodities, and you can easily switch from one to the other if the price ratio changes. So if pomegranates become much cheaper than mangoes, you'll eat more pomegranates and less mangoes. It's easy to do. And you throw it all into your stomach, and your stomach doesn't change much in size, et cetera, at least during each meal it doesn't change in size. So you have fixed costs that way, et cetera, et cetera. And they've simply made an analogy across to that, to the productive system. So if if labour gets more expensive, you throw more machines in, same level of output. You can't do that. Production is very, very set ratios. And if you want to change the technology, you've got to change the entire structure of the factory. It can't be done in the same way you can imagine consumers swap from pomegranates to mangoes. So it's a necessity that it works that way, and that's why it fails. And when I look at what neoclassical economics has done, what it's done is prove why the classical and the physiocrats before them were right and the neoclassicals are wrong. Haven't proven that. They should have gotten out of the way in about 1950. In fact, 1953, which is the year of my birth, should have been the year of the death of neoclassical economics, because that's when Gorman worked out that you couldn't derive a downward sloping market demand curve unless you assumed, as he did, that an extra dollar would be spent the same way no matter whom it is given. Okay? Then you had, the assumptions don't matter from Milton Friedman, which really didn't say assumptions don't matter at all. It says, don't touch our assumptions. Don't criticize our assumptions. That's what's that about. It's not saying you can assume anything you like. It's saying we can assume what we like and you can't criticize us. It's non-scientific. It has to go.
Okay, thank you. Seika, please.
Yes, thank you, Steve. I would like to ask about the analysis of the big firm. We are seeing that increase in the diversity of money forms, crypto, et cetera, and we discuss how this diversity of money forms has implication in the financial costs of the firm, and also this tendency in the decline of cost of intangible production. So this has huge implication in the organization of the firm. And this obviously discussed with the neoclassical model because it doesn't fit with the model itself. So I would like to ask you a comment about this.
I'd actually recommend a person whose PhD I marked, as it happens, called Blair Fix. I don't know if you've actually seen Blair's name. He's currently working as a research associate in the University of, it's the University of, one of the ones in Toronto. I can't think of its name right now, but Blair Fix, F-I-X. Blair, B-L-A-I-R, Fix. And Blair has, I was actually just typed the name into the chat here. He's done excellent work explaining the size of firms on the basis of hierarchy and also energy consumption. It's all empirically based work. It's quite brilliant. And I think if you wanted to get somebody who can really say how you should analyse the way corporations develop, the way that gigantic scale evolves, how huge corporations like Amazon come about and dominate a market for so long, and then can collapse very rapidly if some other competitor comes in effectively under them. Blair's work is by far the best on that subject. And he actually, funnily enough, I was in Ecuador, giving a talk in Ecuador. Then I had to fly to Canada to mark Blair's thesis. I read it on the plane on the flight across America. About the most useful thing one can do in America is read Blair Fix's PhD on the way across it. And I was stunned by how innovative his work was. And my big question to him in the examination was, how did you come up with your insight? And he actually answered it before I asked the question, saying it was the only way to make sense of the empirical data. So if you look at the scale of remuneration of top executives, the number of people they work for, and the size of a corporation, it all comes down to hierarchy and the amount of energy consumed. And that I think is the insight. That should be the basis of microeconomics going forward.
Okay. Thank you so much, Steve. Another question, somebody? This conference has been very interesting, Steve. Thank you so much. No more people. Okay.
I don't know if Professor Noemi wants something to add. Yes.
Okay.
You have the mic, Professor.
Okay.
Very interesting question Seika put forward. And actually, it's the problem of financialization, if I may add. And this is actually discussed from the late 19th century. And it would be very interesting to read your students' dissertation in terms to see what we are doing in terms of the importance of financial capital in big corporations. I think it's completely crucial today in how to get out from this financial organization, a much modern system. So this needs still to, and it needs to discuss in terms, I would say, in terms of the big firms. You just cannot discuss it, financialization everywhere. I will put it, I will strain the issue on big firms. I think this, because they're the only ones who can access to that, and they don't need finance, they can lend, they can pass liquidity to other firms. This is the important issue today. And thank you very much, Steve. It was very interesting, your answers.
Thank you. All right, well, I better go. It's what time is it over here? It's 20 minutes to midnight. So I shall leave you all. And thank you for the invitation. Lovely to see so good, many good friends there. And I hope one of these days I can come back and join you again in Mexico City.
Before you leave, we can give you a sign of recognition for your lecture. Let me share the screen.
Civil recognition.
Yeah. Let me. Okay. Let me share this.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing.
You can see it?
Knowledge.
Yes, thank you. Okay.
¿Lo puedes leer, Jorge?
Okay. La Facultad de Economía gives you the certificate to Steve King for his participation as a main speaker in the 8th International Seminar on Heterodox Microeconomics with the lecture Separating Fact from Fiction in the Theory of Supply Curve, November 8, 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
For this marvelous presentation, Professor King.
Thank you. Good night all, and good to see you all again. Bye-bye.
See you.
¿Ya terminó?
Sí, ya terminó.